I'll never forget that night. It was my second year working overnight shifts at a dementia care facility, a converted boarding house in a quiet, gentrified neighborhood. It was the kind of place that seemed charming during the day, but transformed into something else entirely after dark. I was 23, fresh out of training, and in charge of 15 residents, all at various stages of dementia. It was just me, alone, keeping watch while the rest of the world slept. Around 3 a.m., after finishing my routine intentional round, checking on each resident to make sure they were safe, I heard it. The doorbell rang. At first I thought I imagined it. Who would ring the bell at this hour? The facility was secure, locked down tight to prevent residents from wandering out. I felt a wave of goosebumps ripple across my skin as I went to the front window. I pulled back the curtain and peered outside. Nothing, just the empty street and the soft glow of the streetlights. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a fluke, electrical interference, or some kind of mechanical glitch. But 10 minutes later, the bell rang again. This time, my chest tightened. I didn't want to look out the window, but I forced myself to. Again, no one was at the door. But across the street, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked under a tree. Its windows were dark, and something about it felt wrong. I snapped a photo with my phone just in case, and hurried back to the common area. One of the residents, a sweet older woman with advanced dementia, was sitting at the table with me. We'd been playing a simple card game to keep her calm. As I sat down, she looked at me with a smile that froze my blood. "What did the gentleman want, dearie? He looked like he had a bad night. Maybe he just needs a cuppa." I stared at her, my pulse pounding in my ears. She had no idea what time it was or where she even was half the time. Her words shouldn't have meant anything, but they did. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang again. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I couldn't ignore the rising panic clawing at the edges of my mind. One of the more restless residents was wandering the hallway, holding a clean paintbrush, painting imaginary murals on the walls to keep himself occupied. As I walked past him, he paused and looked directly at me. "Don't answer the door alone," he muttered, his voice calm but firm. "He might hurt you." Then he turned back to his invisible masterpiece and kept painting. My heart was racing now, every instinct screaming at me to lock down the building. I crept to the window one more time and peeked out. The car was still there, and as I scanned the area, I saw a shadow move in front of the door. Then he appeared. A man stepped into view, walking around the corner of the house. He was tall, disheveled, and clearly on edge. His movements were jittery, like he was desperate for something. Before I could react, he stopped at the door and began trying the handle. It was locked, thank God. I backed away from the window, panic setting in, when he started banging on the door. Hard. "Let me in," he shouted, his voice rough and slurred. "I know you're in there." I froze for a second, unsure of what to do. Then I bolted for the door, fast-shotting the deadbolt to make sure it was secure. The banging grew louder, more frantic, and the sound echoed through the quiet halls. My residents started to stir. I could hear them shuffling around, mumbling in confusion. The man's fists pounded against the door, and I knew I didn't have much time. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to the operator. "Please hurry," I whispered. "He's trying to get in." The operator assured me help was on the way. I stood there, gripping the phone tightly, staring at the door as the man continued to yell and pound. I could hear the fear in the residents' voices behind me, but I couldn't turn away. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the silence stretched on. I dared to peek out the window again. The man was gone. The car was gone. When the police arrived a few minutes later, they searched the area but found nothing. It took hours to calm the residents down, many of whom were confused and scared by the commotion. I spent the rest of the night checking the locks, jumping at every sound. The next morning, my relief shift arrived, and I told them everything. That's when they shared the chilling news. A woman down the street had been attacked in her home that night. A drug seeker had broken in, assaulted her, and ransacked her house looking for narcotics. I felt the blood drain from my face. We had a locked medroom full of powerful drugs, morphine, methadone, fentanyl. If he'd gotten inside... That was my last straw. I quit soon after when management refused to add a second night staffer. To this day, I can still hear the sound of his fists pounding on the door and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked it in time. Three years ago, I worked as a night shift custodian at a middle school. It wasn't a job I'd planned to stay in for long, but I needed the paycheck after my construction business folded. The hours were quiet, the work was predictable, and I liked being left alone. Most nights were uneventful, but there was one that I can't forget. The U-shaped wing of classrooms was my responsibility. I worked through it methodically, cleaning one classroom at a time, locking doors as I went. By the time I reached the far end of the wing, it was always past 10 p.m. That night was no different. At the time, I wasn't completely alone in the school. There was another custodian, Gary, who was older and mostly kept to himself. He handled the gym and cafeteria while I focused on the classrooms. Gary wasn't the chatty type, but he was good at his job and had been working there for over 15 years. He once told me he liked the quiet because it gave him time to think. "It's peaceful if you don't let your imagination get to you," he'd said with a chuckle. That night, I hadn't seen Gary since we clocked in. He had a habit of keeping his routine tight, so I assumed he was on the other side of the building, finishing his rounds. Around 10:45 p.m., I was in the last classroom of the wing, sweeping up near the windows. The only sounds were the soft rasp of the broom against the floor and the occasional hum of the air vents. I glanced at the clock, eager to finish up, when I heard something faint in the hallway outside. It wasn't loud, just the faint shuffle of movement, like someone brushing against a wall. I paused, listening, but the sound stopped. Shrugging it off, I finished sweeping, turned off the lights, and walked into the hallway. My next task was to lock the double doors at the end of the wing, so I started my usual lap. As I walked, I thought about Gary's comment from a few weeks ago. It's peaceful until it isn't. I hadn't given it much thought then, but for some reason, it stuck with me that night. When I reached the far end of the wing, I flipped off the lights, casting the hallway into darkness. That's when I saw it, something small darting across the hallway from left to right. It was quick, but clear enough to register. It looked like a child, hunched over slightly as it moved. My hand was still on the light switch, and I stood there for a moment, staring down the empty hallway. The double doors were just beyond where the figure had disappeared, and I knew they were locked. I'd checked them earlier. I tried to think rationally. Maybe Gary was messing with me, but the figure didn't match his build. It was small, about the size of a middle schooler, and moved with an urgency that didn't feel playful. I walked toward the doors, my boots thudding softly on the linoleum. The hallway stretched on, empty and quiet, but every step felt heavier than the last. When I reached the end, I checked the doors. They were locked, just as I'd left them. I looked back down the hallway and saw nothing but shadows. As I stood there, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. Then, from halfway down the wing, I saw movement again, a door swinging open just slightly. Room 214. For a second, I debated walking away. My shift was almost over, and I could lock up and leave. But what if it was a student? Maybe a kid who stayed behind as a prank or fell asleep and got locked in. I couldn't risk leaving without checking. I approached room 214, my keys clinking in my hand. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the hinges let out a soft creak. I flicked on the light and stepped inside. The room was empty. I checked every corner, even the supply closet. Nothing was out of place. The desks were neatly arranged, the whiteboard blank. But as I turned off the light to leave, I noticed something that made me pause. A faint, smudged handprint on the glass of the door. It was small, the size of a child's hand, and low enough to make me question who could have left it. I locked the door and made my way back down the hall, checking over my shoulder more than once. When I reached the connecting doors to the rest of the school, I locked them quickly and left the building without another glance. Gary was outside smoking when I reached the parking lot. He gave me a nod and asked if everything was fine. I wanted to tell him about the figure, the handprint, but I stopped myself. What could I say? He'd probably laugh it off or tell me my imagination was running wild. I never did figure out what I saw that night. But for the rest of the time I worked there, I avoided the U-wing as much as I could. Even now, 3 years later, the memory of that small figure and the handprint lingers. Whatever it wasn't my imagination. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. When I first started working at the prison, I was warned about the overtime shifts. Long nights in housing units were notorious for testing your patience and occasionally your nerves. But I needed the money, so when I got called in to cover a shift in Unit C, I took it without hesitation. Unit C had a reputation. It wasn't the roughest block, but it had seen its fair share of violence. Fights, overdoses, suicides, you name it. The place carried a weight that you could feel the moment you stepped inside. Some officers joked that the walls were soaked in bad energy, but I wasn't the type to believe in that stuff. That night, I was running solo after midnight. The offenders were supposed to be locked in their cells, but this was medium security, so they had permission to leave for the communal bathroom at night. My job was to do the 2 a.m. count, make sure everyone was accounted for, and confirm no one was where they shouldn't be. The first level was quiet. Everyone was either asleep or pretending to be. I walked past the cells, checking off names, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim lighting. Everything seemed normal. When I reached the second level, exhaustion started creeping in. My eyes were heavy, and my legs felt like they had weights strapped to them. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of bedding or faint snores. I finished the count and descended back to the first level, eager to wrap up. That's when I saw him. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement on the stairs. A tall, skinny man with long dreads was coming down, his gray jumpsuit blending with the dim lighting. His steps were slow, almost deliberate, like he wasn't in any rush. I didn't recognize him right away, but I figured he was heading to the bathroom. Late-night bathroom run, I muttered to myself, making a mental note to account for the extra body. I followed him to the bathroom, stopping just outside the doorway. The light inside was weak, casting long shadows across the tiled walls. I could hear the faint drip of a faucet echoing off the walls. "Hey, what cell are you from?" I called out, keeping my voice firm but calm. No answer. I stepped closer to the doorway, craning my neck to see inside. The stalls were all closed, and the sinks were empty. I tried again, louder this time. "What's your cell number?" Silence. Unease prickled at the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. I stepped into the bathroom, my boots echoing against the tiles. The air felt colder in there, almost damp. I checked each stall, opening the doors one by one. Empty. I scanned the shower area. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. I knew what I had seen. A man with long dreads, clear as day, walking toward the bathroom. But now, it was like he had vanished into thin air. A sudden creak behind me made me spin around. But there was nothing there, just the empty hallway outside. Trying to shake off the growing unease, I finished my count and reported everything as normal. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. When my coworker arrived for their shift, I decided to mention it. "I saw someone come down the stairs and head into the bathroom," I said, keeping my tone casual. Tall guy, skinny, long dreads, but when I went in to check, no one was there. Their face immediately grew serious. "Was he wearing a gray jumpsuit?" I nodded, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "Yeah. Why?" They leaned in, their voice dropping. "That's Mr. Bones. He used to be in Unit C, back before you started. He killed himself in his cell about 3 years ago. But people still see him around, especially near the bathroom." I stared at them, waiting for a laugh or some kind of joke. But their expression didn't change. "Are you messing with me?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Dead serious," they replied. "He was always walking around late at night, just like you described. You're not the first person to see him." The rest of my shift felt like it dragged on forever. Every shadow, every noise made my skin crawl. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, the way he walked down the stairs so casually, like he belonged there. Even now, years later, I think about that night whenever I pass by Unit C. I still don't know who or what I saw, but it matched the stories perfectly. Whether it was my exhaustion playing tricks on me or something I'll never understand, I know one thing for sure. Seeing Mr. Bones in that bathroom was spooky as hell.